Today we're going to talk about one of the regular player types you will encounter in your poker experience, NITs. These guys are the tightest of the tight. They typically have a strong hand when they enter a pot, and they will often be showing down the nuts if the pot gets big. NITs typically have a very math-based approach to the game and thus tend to play only when the odds are in their favor. This is not to say that they can't be beat. They're just the polar opposite of easy money. At low-stakes games, NITs enjoy a high concentration of the population. Their style yields very big profits from weak players who don't realize they shouldn't be giving this player type action because they have the goods so often and very rarely bluff. While they won't be the biggest winners in the low-stakes game due to their failure to adjust to their opponents, most regulars at low stakes will be NITs, and they will be earning a steady profit. So we're going to talk a little bit about these guys, their strengths and weaknesses, and what are good spots to take advantage of their predictable nature. If you're using Poker Tracker or Hold'em Manager, and I hope you are, these are the stats that indicate a nitty player. In full ring, stats of voluntary percentage put in pot will be 8 or lower. Pre-flop raise will be 6%, and aggression should be around 4. It could be as high as 6, and it could be as low as 3. In a short-handed game, 5 or 6 max, VPIP we would expect to be around 18%, pre-flop raise 14, and again a pretty high aggression factor. As I mentioned before, NIT's strengths lie in their mathematical and logical approach to the game. First off, they will only be playing strong hands or speculative hands if the situation is correct. These guys are the definition of set miners. They will almost always call raises with pairs in any attempt to stack the raiser. We'll get into how to exploit this bad habit later, but let's just say they call too many raises with pocket pairs at improper spots, and it is a bit of a leak. Secondly, these players are typically hyper-aggressive. It only makes sense because they so often have the goods that they will be betting hard and fast when they do play. Their high aggression level keeps them in control and is quite tough to combat. Lastly, NITs are very risk-averse, meaning they don't like to take big gambles. NITs like to make their hands before they commit a lot of chips. This means they don't experience a lot of variance, and their profits are slow but steady and very rarely in the wrong direction. If you're a nitty player, you'll probably earn a steady earn, and you won't have very big upswings or downswings. It'll just be a very stable way to make a living. So they're solid players and smart ones too, but no poker player or poker style is perfect. So let's get into some weaknesses in the nitty players. First off, NITs are too honest. I talk about it in my barrel theory lesson, but these guys are only capable of bluffing on one street typically, firing one bullet. If a NIT bets twice post-flop, and I really mean flop and turn here, 2 consecutive barrels, they have the goods. And being the smart adjusting player that we aren't going to be paying them off when they're telling us they're holding a made hand. Similar to the first leak, NITs are also too trusting. In fact, I think that NITs are the easiest opponents to bluff in poker. As I said before, they don't like variance and they don't like to take chances. So if you can give them a good reason to fold, a nice, believable story that makes sense, they'll probably take your word for it and concede the pots. NITs always fear that their opponent is holding a big hand when they have something marginally good. Be sure to let them know that yes, their fears are warranted by representing what they fear. I can't tell you how paranoid I am when I get pocket aces in early position and I get flat called by 2 or 3 people. I always think that a set's going to get there. But that's just because I'm a NIT and that's the way I think. Lastly, NITs overvalue implied odds. I've seen so many nits in my time limp and call raises with pocket pairs, even though they're out of position and heads up going to the flop. And as you guys know from our Pause EV lesson, this is not what you want with a speculative hand. They always assume that if they hit, they will get action. And against weak players at low limits, this is true. They will get action. But as long as you can catch the signs and don't pay them off, if you don't give this nit his implied odds, he can't be a winning player against you. Simple as that, because his style is not one based on outplaying. His style is based on getting paid when he has the goods. So just don't play into his strategy and don't pay him off when he's representing that big hand. Now that we've covered the strengths and weaknesses of nits, I'm going to give you guys some adjustments you can introduce to your game to play optimally against this player type. The first adjustment is very easy, and that is to avoid them as much as possible. When they raise, especially early position, unless you have a premium hand, typically the best plan is to simply get out of their way. We already know that they only raise good hands, so why would you give them action? Let the suckers who don't label their opponents give the nits action. I'll stick to outplaying easy money, thank you very much. Now, I'm not saying you should fold, a speculative hand when a nit raises early position. In fact, this is the perfect time to play a speculative hand. But don't be calling the raises with hands like ace-queen and expecting to win a good pot if you hit top pair. You want to either have the premium of the premiums, like aces or kings, when you're facing early position range, or play the type of hand that can crack them, because we know they have a good hand, so our implied odds are generally good against these guys, even though they are capable of folding the big overpair. The second adjustment is to trap and slow play. As I said earlier, nits are hyper aggressive, and when they have top pair are better. If you flop something good, or have like a big pair pre-flop, you should lean towards smooth calling their bets. When you raise, alarm bells go off in nits' heads. They see a raise as their chance to get out of the hand unless they have a super strong hand. Unless it's a cooler like set over set, which would still see all the money going on the river, typically raising will just get the nit to fold. If you have a decent one-pair hand or better, typically just calling their bets, waiting until the river to raise, will yield the maximum profit from them. Sometimes it's not even smart to raise the river and you should just call them down the whole way. Use their hyper-aggression against them. Let them hang themselves. Don't let them know where you're at by raising. Also, by playing like this against them, your calls will strike some sort of fear in them, and they will probably decrease their frequency of continuation bet bluffs, and this gets them to play more honest against us. And of course, the more honest you can make an opponent play, the better, because this game's all about getting perfect information when we can to make the proper decisions. The third adjustment is to take them out of their element. Raise. As I said, nits like to play much in the same fashion we teach here at Grips.com, with the lead, in position, with a good hand. As I just mentioned, when nits get raised, they get scared. So if you flop any sort of draw or something against them, something that doesn't have showdown value because it's maybe a high card hand, but has big hand potential and has equity, you should raise their continuation bet since they will fold such a high percentage of the time, and we can win the pot, gaining a lot of equity. We want to slow play when we can beat most of their range, but raise with our weakish hands that have equity. Against nits, our fold equity is through the roof. Sure, they only show down the nuts, but it's pretty hard to make the nuts, so that means about 80% of the time or more, they're conceding the pot to counter-aggression. Another way to use their fear of counter-aggression to your advantage for much lower risk is to re-raise them pre-flop. Now, 3-betting introduces variance to your game, but that's only if your opponents call your 3-bets. Nits have wider ranges in late position, as do most players, but they fold about 80% of their opening range to re-raises. This means that technically, 3-betting them with any two cards is profitable, but I would suggest picking just like 3 or 4 suited connectors, your choice, to 3-bet them and see how it fares against them. You'll pick up a ton of chips at low risk by 3-betting them pre-flop because they're going to fold a ton. And when they do call, I would suggest firing 3/4 of the pot no matter what until they show a willingness to play back at you. It'll be a huge moneymaker because even though they'll call your 3-bet with like ace, king, or queens, they're going to fold on a lot of flops that they don't like. And of course, once your opponent adjusts, you should also adjust. But for an initial out-of-the-gate strategy, the most profitable way to exploit a NIT is this 3-betting pre-flop and c-betting hard when the board comes down. Take them out of their comfort zone. Don't let them control the action. Unless you're trapping, of course. And another adjustment just specifically for NITs is floating. The reason, I want to put a little disclaimer on this beforehand and tell you to not go crazy with this, because floating brings in a lot of variance to your game, and you will be in a lot of spots where you don't have a hand and you don't necessarily know where you're at. But the idea behind floating is calling a flop bet with no real hand, just the intention of taking the pot away on a later street. The reason it works well against NITs is because most NITs have a one-and-done policy. They will continuation bet the flop, and then they will give up afterwards if they don't improve. So, if we have like a gut shot or whatever, and we don't think we really have the right pot odds to call their bet, we can call it anyway because we know that about 80% of the time they will shut down on the turn and give us the pot. So we can call their flop bet light because they're check folding a lot of turns and we're winning a bigger pot. Now, when they check the turn and you bet, if they check raise you, you should get out of the hand. And if they check call you, you should not bet the river. If a NIT calls your turn bet, he will probably call your river bet. So don't waste any more money if your float doesn't work. And if you found that your opponent has been adjusting to your floating and it's not seeming to be an extremely profitable play, then just, stop doing it so much and try it against someone else. It's not a key part of my game, floating, but a lot of people do use it, and I do think it is a good tool to have in your arsenal. Finally, the last adjustment, which is a common one throughout poker in general, is to attack weakness. I included it here because NITs are very honest players. If they check the flop after raising pre-flop, they probably missed. If they c-bet the flop and check the turn like we just talked about, they probably have no pair and we can steal a ton of pots from them. If they limp in, they probably have a weak hand that they will be folding unless they make two pair or a set. So, put the pressure on them. Until they show they are able to check raise you or check call multiple barrels, assume their checks are weak, and bet like 90% of the time when they check. Until they show you that they can check as a trap, you should consider their checks as a sign that the pot is ripe. The pot is ripe for the taking. That about covers my thought on NITs, and I don't mean to toot my own horn here, but I know this stuff pretty cold since I am a NIT born and raised. Don't take the adjustments to the extreme, as some NITs are smarter than the average bear and will make counter adjustments to you. If you can find NITs who never change their spots and always play the same low variance style, you can make their life hell to the point that they will do random spews because they just get sick of your re-raising and can't believe how aggressive you are and get so frustrated. I've been guilty of doing this myself. So, NITs tilt too. Just be sure to pick your spots and be aware of your image in their eyes. As long as you can stay one step ahead, you'll be taking home the bread at the end of the day. This has been Grips for my lesson on NITs, and I hope you guys found it helpful.